All right.
All right, we're recording. What's up, Peter? How's it going, man?
Good, man. How you doing? So I suggest like a different approach here because we are recording and we do know it. Let's like just acknowledge. So Joe and I, we decided to record a proto podcast just because we've been talking daily and we've been sort of locked up in our apartments. So this is the first episode of the Corona podcast. And yeah, there's a few things that we both have been thinking about and um, that I think are relevant to what's going on. And like one is that I've been working on a sort of writing a little bit of an article. I don't know where I'm going to post it or who I'm going to send it to, but the basic idea is that there's this move towards these proto martial law measures going on right now. Sort of clampdowns on people moving around, limiting people to 5 at once. And, you know, by and large, I think this stuff is a good idea. Like, I think we should all be staying at home wherever possible. We should be avoiding interacting with one another. But the problem is that if they impose some kind of full-on martial law, how do we know that whatever rights and freedoms they take away are going to come back? And also, did
people should think about how they're going to act when that happens, because it's not immediately obvious, you know?
Are we going to push back? To what degree? How far should we be embracing this versus how far should we be rejecting it? And yeah, that's the gist of it, I think.
Yeah, and how much do you trust your government?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what is martial law? You know, martial law, it's not just like lockdowns and like, you know, someone going by saying, please stay in your homes. Like, that's certainly part of it. But it is the removal of all rights and freedoms substituted with military rule, right? And that's...
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about, like, in particular, the role freedom of speech actually plays in a situation like this, right?
Yeah.
So we talked about this yesterday, like pretty disturbing development seems sort of innocuous at face value, but it's not, which is that, you know, the big social media companies, they're already combing through people's, just private people, not like public figures or anything, combing through their posts to see if people post what they consider to be misinformation or fake news regarding stuff to do with the virus. So, you know, if you talk about the efficacy of some medication or something, and it hasn't, you know, been, you know, officially vetted by the CDC or WHO, they'll remove your post. And they've also been centralizing all of the official authorities into one sort of news feed and then giving them particular prominence. And there's nothing at face value that's wrong with that. Except it sort of raises the question of what does Twitter's role in all this seem to be? Like, you know, presumably I would guess that the WHO and CDC can do their own promotional material and people can follow them if they want to. And, you know, it's just disturbing, those twin things happening at the same time, the promotion of official sources and then combing through everyone's social media to get rid of anything that might be considered disinformation. Because, you know, in a situation like this, I mean, that's rapidly evolving, where you got lots of different people looking at the data sets, you're going to need, there's going to be at times what seems like contradictory information, and you're going to need forums and platforms for that to be actually shared. And also, we should talk about the role that freedom of speech played in causing, or the lack of freedom of speech played in causing this fucking mess to begin with, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the thing, right? Like, because I mean, it does seem, I don't know if I would use the word innocuous to describe what it seems to me, but I do understand, I can envision or imagine a positive intention behind it. Let's say that, right? Where it's like, so for, say, Twitter to not want misinformation to spread around, not want to instill panic, not want people to like go taking fish tank cleaner because they hear that there's hydrochloroquine in it because, you know, Donald Trump said that
Wait, is that true?
medication that might be on the horizon, which, you know, I think it's a little silly to put that on him. But like, so that's one aspect. But yeah, like in China, like when this virus first started to spread and people started to get sick and die, the government clamped down on that information, and people very courageously, I would say, went on WeChat, which is their basically state-controlled internet, like social media platform, and they were pretty fearless about sharing images of stuff. And then when it got banned from WeChat, like, you know, everyone from, I think there was some local tailor that started taking photos around. Doctors started to take photos. There was that billionaire who was very critical of the chairman, and they all got imprisoned.
And
The
also, you know,
billionaires
it's
disappeared.
worth mentioning that like one of the reasons that like we were on this early is like I remember videos in January
Yeah,
that came out of Wuhan of courageous people taking videos of what was going on in the hospitals and what the government was doing, dragging people off the streets, and they were posting them to Twitter. You know, and Twitter's a force multiplier in that, you know, once something gets retweeted by anyone who's not behind the Great Firewall of China, it's pretty much sort of fucking out there. Like it, you know, it grows exponentially in the same way of a virus. Like it's the same math, right?
yeah,
Um, and the CCP was doing everything it could to pull those videos down as quick as possible. Um, you know, arresting people, including the doctor that tried to blow the whistle on this like really early on. And just like some thought and consideration should be given to the general idea that if the initial phase of this outbreak happened in a country with free speech, those images, those voices, and those cries for help wouldn't have been suppressed, and the government would have been forced to be more responsive. Like the CCP was in this position where they figured we can manage the flow of information, we can manage what's happening, we don't have to tell anyone, we don't have to notify anyone, we can just sort of try and handle this ourselves. And those first critical weeks were disastrous when they tried to contain this by themselves and basically covered it up. And you know, those images, those videos that came out months ago, like they're also the reason why, you know, people like us and all around the world were able to actually do some prep and prepare, not like a fucking week ago or
yeah,
whatever, because we knew this was coming, right? And you know, if in liberal Western democracies, if there's some sort of restriction in a more draconian way on who can share information and why, like, I just can't imagine any scenario in which that's beneficial for anyone.
yeah. Like, well, this is the thing, right? Because like in China, like, you know, I would go so far as to say that like where it's not just that they would have been forced to act, but you know, I mean, we have our free speech issues with our own country and with the United States, and you know, you and I talk about that all the time. But like, you know, we don't look at this as like, you know, the epitome of freedom, but certainly by contrast to China it is. And I think like if what happened there were to have started here, say some like, you know, some like deer-borne disease jumped to a human via a tick or something and started to
Yeah.
spread, um, that there's a culture around freedom of information and like kind of what's the word I'm looking for, like a way of handling things with that in place that would have started with like, you know, reports right away, doctors being free to investigate and check it out, you know, probably like notifying people like the Center for Disease Control or even the World Health Organization if it started to get rapid. And then like a lot of resources might have poured in from outward, right? Like things might have been able to shut down very quickly. I don't know that our response would have been as thorough as it needs to be, judging by the fact that we saw this coming from like November and like they're kind of like, oh, maybe we should shut a couple things down. You know what I mean? Like it was kind of wishy-washy all in all. But yeah, from that point on. And the other thing is that freedoms, not just freedom of speech, but all freedom is what leads to innovation. And I think innovation is, what we're seeing a lot right now in the face of this, like that doctor in Ontario who figured out how to make one ventilator treat 9 people. Like that
Yep.
is, a 9x increase in our ability to
Was
protect
this
people.
was this the thing with the 3D printers?
No, that was another doctor in Italy, apparently. Or yeah, they figured out a valve that you could use to take like one of those like frogman masks and make it into a ventilator. Although I've heard sort of mixed things about that. Dyson, the vacuum cleaner people, they have designed a new ventilator and they're mass producing it and trying to distribute it now. Um, so like there's a lot of stuff, and then also of course like the hunt for a vaccine. There's like
Yeah,
a
it's
lot
an
of
open source project, you know.
yeah,
Everyone's working with the same RNA
yeah,
sequences, like everyone's sharing the same information.
yeah.
Um,
With the
you want
notable
every
exception
fucking
of
grad student in
China.
the world working on this, you know, and you
Mhm.
want like an open GitHub style repository where everyone can, share the same information and,
Yeah. With the
peer review
notable
and whatnot.
exception of China, right? Because we like they're like, okay, we've got our numbers down, like, and they may well, like it's possible that like some truth is coming out of, but like, we don't know if what they're
I
saying.
heard I heard numbers like 9 million cell phones dropped off the grid, you know,
Yeah,
um, and that service providers were reporting that, which is like not it's another factoid floating in the ether that's not confirmed or whatever. But like, I'd
yeah,
be very surprised if a regime like the CCP, which lies about everything, is reporting fucking honest numbers.
yeah,
And I just know that they weren't from when this started, because I would remember seeing like the numbers and they'd be like 30 people have it, and then you would see videos and there'd be 30 videos and there'd be multiple, and like you could just count the fucking bodies in the videos that were being displayed on Twitter, um, and it didn't add up to what was being officially reported. And I don't know, I think the default assumption should be that dictatorial communist regimes do not tell the truth, you know.
yeah. I mean, but that's my point. Is like there's this interconnectivity, there's this spirit of innovation, there is like a strong forcing function that this virus is sort of creating in terms of making people come together, to work on it. There's a big need, and like there's this interconnectivity, with the notable exception of the people that were the first ones to deal with it. Right? There's a firewall around them, and the information that comes out from there is, perhaps not true, perhaps mitigated, like they're lying about numbers, and these things are, things that like data analysts and trackers need. If there's like a vaccine in works, like that could be a more coordinated effort. They have a massive amount of resources at their disposal that would be really beneficial to this, and there's this weird, I don't know, it's a bad thing. And I think martial law, like, I mean, the other aspect, right? Besides that, I think it would actually damage our efforts to solve this problem. That it actually, I think, could be argued to be the cause of this problem outside of the virus itself, which could have been contained more easily. There's also like the Stanford Prison Experiment component to
Yeah.
all of this, right? Like, because martial law means, okay, the military is now in charge of the people. They rule directly. There are no laws governing what they can and can't do. And I think that's something that's really important to understand, because martial law implies that there is a military legal order, that there are rules that they have to follow, and they don't. Like, it's not just freedom of speech, it's freedom of assembly, it's habeas corpus, it's the right to a trial, innocence until proven guilty. All of that stuff
And
is out.
the confusion of not no like, okay, so like, imagine a situation, right, like under martial law where the government has its official sort of propaganda organs that it's putting out information and updates through, right?
Yeah,
And one of the updates is like, we're currently in the process of working out a way to get food to everyone and people shouldn't worry or something. And then one day a bunch of soldiers knock on your door and
yeah,
say, we represent the Canadian government, we need to see what food you have, and depending on how much, we need to take some. Now, you have no way of knowing of whether or not this is like a real order, whether or not these are just a couple hungry soldiers who are going to bust in your door and take food because they can. And it's the uncertainty of having no recourse, of not being able to do anything, and just being subject to the whims of people with arbitrary authority. And I think like you don't have to look far throughout history to see what happens when people are under military occupations. And I don't think there's any reason to imagine that a military occupation will be different because you know, the impetus for imposing it was a virus as opposed to some sort of war or conflict. You
Well,
know,
in
we were
fact, I
talking
think
about
that
Camus'
there
book.
is a pervasive fear, right now, right? And I think that the idea of martial law is sitting better with people overall than it should be. Because I think there's like, well, like, you know, a lot of us, like you and I are both like in this self-imposed like quarantine. Um, but you know, there's a lot of people that are still working. They've been declared an essential service, and a lot of those people are probably scared, for example, and they want to go home, right? And
Yeah,
they think if there was some law that said they get to stay home, they would feel that there was, in a sense, more freedom for them to do what they want to do, you know? Um, but I think that impetus combined with sort of a pervasive fear that's just sort of there all the time, not a causeless fear, so not an anxiety, but the fear that's pervasive like anxiety, right? It's just there, ever present, right? That's based on something real. Like when you have that sort of elevated level of fear, like your amygdala is partially, if not entirely, running the show in a way that, like, you know,
yeah,
there's a bit of a drowning man grabbing a rope thing going on here, you know?
yeah.
So I
It
think
leads
there's,
people to make bad decisions.
yeah. And I think that, you know, yeah, fear, desperation, things like that, have in the past made people participate in, comply with, and submit to atrocities, right? So that's one side of this.
Well,
Um,
here I want to plug because, like, I think everyone should fucking read this book who can get their hands on a copy of it. You can order it, even though Indigo's closed. I'm sure you can find it on Amazon or whatever. But
yeah,
read The Plague by Camus. And what this is it's the story of a small town, about 200,000 people in France, that undergoes a quarantine when they have a resurgence of plague. And the book is a study of all the people in the town and how they react to being basically placed under quarantine. Now, when Camus wrote it, um, the idea was it was supposed to be a metaphor for the Nazi occupation in France during the Second World War. So what happened is the Nazi soldiers came in, they occupied the town, they shut everything down, and you got to see how people reacted. And he's using this vehicle of a pandemic or a plague to sort of tell that story. But it's definitely timely, and worth it's definitely worth giving a read because it has a lot of insight into different people and how they're going to react inside a situation like that, you
yeah,
know? And there's more roles than just collaborator or resistor, you know? There's lots of different types of people in the world, and it's not immediately obvious how everyone responds once the freedoms they've taken for granted their entire lives are completely fucking stripped away.
yeah. Now it's like, you know, okay, so there's a few things here, like a few caveats to all this. Shamu. Like there's a few caveats to some of this that I think, like, I don't know that they would want to necessarily take our freedoms away for a long period of time, right? Like that a country where there is productivity and industry benefits the farmer as well as it does the livestock in a sense, right? Like
Yep.
if I may use a crude metaphor. So like, you know, the like ruling classes, like if you want to get like super paranoid about this, which I am, in terms of like the way I view government, obviously, you know, they are the farmers and we are the livestock. But you know, they want like a healthy, functioning, free-range farm because you get more produce out of it, right? And I think that I don't think that they would want to see like a military dictatorship, boots on the ground. However, I do think that like from a place of zero freedoms, you can slowly reintroduce freedoms and then you don't have to bring them all back. You can make sweeping power grabs. There's a woman I listen to, Carrie Wedler. She's like a libertarian podcaster. She's an interesting character, and she made a list of uh, if we do some sort of link posting in this thing, I'll post a link to that.
Probably, yeah, probably
It's
can.
but like, I'm trying to remember, but yeah, she made some examples of things that they tried to pass through Congress. Fuck, I can't remember them right now, but like, like Congress actually stopped some like some power grabbing shit basically that different agencies and stuff were trying to push through, like furthering of like privacy legislation. I think there was an attempt to like repeal some of the Patriot Act, and they're attempting to block that now because of this crisis, among other things. Yeah, and they want like broader monitoring of people, like sort of sweeping powers and things like that. So yeah, like, and a few people I've heard have mentioned stuff like this, like Lex Friedman from the Artificial Intelligence podcast has talked about this as a concern. And yeah, so I mean, like, I don't know that we would just be under martial law forever, but I don't know that we would get all the way back either, right? And I think that it's very important that heading into this, whatever it might be, that we start pushing back now, because it's very possible we won't be able to push back in any meaningful way other than going out in the street or something once it happens, right? And yeah, that could get
It's
very
not even, see, it's tricky because it's not even like you don't want people going out in the streets. Like,
no, we don't.
My concern is just that, like at some point, you should give that analogy about the way exponential functions actually work, like with the stadium or whatever. Because like we're in a situation where it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And
what is that analogy? You should, I think you should lay that out because it's interesting and I think it's very relevant to everything we're talking about.
So this is like just trying to give a visualization of the way exponential math actually works, where it's like if you had like a full, what is it, like a baseball or football stadium, and you started with one drop of water, like how many doublings would it take, or how long would it take doubling at a consistent rate before the entire thing is full? And I don't remember
this. Double it every second or something like that.
Yeah, and I think the general assumption is that it's going to take a long time before that happens. The reality is that it doesn't. The part that's counterintuitive is that, like, for 95% of the time, there's barely any water. And then the runaway process happens in the last 5%, where you just go from like it's under control, there's just a little puddle, to boom, 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 and everyone's underwater. And that happens really quick. And we're definitely nowhere near that point. And if you have a situation where there's just like the potential for a lot of social unrest, a lot of people to die, and you just throw military rule into that mess, I'm more worried about how is the Canadian military going to react in a situation like that?
So I think I just want to clarify that whole thing for a moment because I think it's significant. So the metaphor is, if you had like a football stadium and you were to take a drop of water and every second you were to double that drop of water, how long would it take for the stadium to fill up entirely? And the number is 50 minutes. 50 minutes. People think like days. It happened in 50 minutes. And for 93% of the time, or 93, I think it was 93% of the stadium would fill up in the last 5 minutes. So for most of the time, the stadium would be almost entirely empty. And then in the last 5 minutes, so for 45 minutes, it would be mostly empty. And then in the last 5 minutes, like something like 95% of the whole stadium would fill up, right? So how that translates to the disease is like it's growing at an exponential rate. It's doubling every couple of days. And we're seeing numbers in like thousands now, in our native countries or provinces or whatever. And we think that it's sort of moving at what looks steady. But in fact, at the very tip, when it reaches its peak, which I think people are saying is like around June, there will be a very rapid acceleration that will surprise people. And I think that's something people have to be ready for. And it will be very jarring. Like the fear that we're all feeling will be a lot stronger. Um, and I think that, you know, by staying home now, actually, we're doing a lot more to protect, like to prevent that from being much larger. And I hope we're doing a good job of that. And, you know, it's really impossible to tell. Like, I don't know in terms of the reporting on how numbers of
And also,
tests, yada, yada, yada. Yeah.
yeah, can we talk about like social distancing and like social isolation and like what the point of all this is? Because like,
Yeah.
you know, there seems to be a notion out there that like people should stay home so they don't get sick. And, you know, conversely, there's the notion that you should stay home so you don't get other people sick. And both of those are sort of true in a sense. But like what the real function of this is to ensure that everybody doesn't get sick at the same fucking time. So our healthcare system doesn't get bombarded. But people should mentally adjust and prepare for the idea that they are going to get this, you know, and that this is a novel virus, that no one has any immunity to it yet. There are best case scenarios, which is like, you know, maybe someone pulls a rabbit out of the hat and finds, you know, can rush through a vaccine before, you know, we just hit a saturation point where everyone's immune system has to do the hard work. Or like a scenario like we talked about before with a sample size that's like the entire globe, there's so much data that what's going to happen is there's going to be anomalies, right? So it's like running a giant controlled experiment where every population is hit with the same virus, only every population has different nutritional, every culture has different sort of like, you know, nutritional norms around diet, around exercise, around how close or far, you know, people stay in contact with each other.
Yeah.
And
Like
eventually
handshakes,
with
hugs,
this much,
kisses on the
yeah,
cheeks, and stuff like that.
yeah, but like with this
Yeah.
much data, you're going to see anomalies, and they should be helpful in that eventually, you know, a bunch of people from some nursing home are going to get dragged into a hospital because they have an outbreak, and they're all like high risk people in their 80s, and for some reason they all live. And, you know, the CDC is going to come in and look at that and be like, well, what's going on here? Why did these people respond so well? And maybe they trace it back and they figure that, well, a large chunk of the people who did well were on this type of medication. Or maybe they were, you know, at the nursing home, they look at the menu and they see, you know, the diet was unusually rich in vitamin C or some, you know, I'm just making shit up or whatever.
Yeah.
But with
So you're
like a
saying
sample
vitamin
size
C in
this big,
particular, right?
they'll find something and
Yeah.
investigate it. But, you know, no one knows how long that's going to take. But people should work on the assumption that like they're going to get this. Like everyone is going to get this at some point,
Yeah.
you know.
And
And
you're
that's why it's
saying that,
good to keep yourself healthy, you
yeah.
know.
No, that's really important. And you're saying vitamin C cures the coronavirus, right?
Yeah,
You're going on
exactly.
record here, and all right. So, Dr.
I say
Joseph.
keep yourself healthy, and I'm like reaching for a fucking cigarette.
Yeah.
Humans are messy and contradictory.
Yes. We shouldn't be smoking.
Only Hashem can judge me, Peter.
Well, it's not a moral judgment, but Hashem loves you, and He wants you to live through this thing, and so do I. But yeah, like no, I think that it's very important, and you know, like not only does it minimize the risk of disease, but I also think like social isolation, physical isolation, because I haven't been more social than like in the past little while in quite some time. Actually, I've been talking to like everybody I know.
Yeah,
Um,
me too.
but like, I think that not only does it like lessen the speed at which this crisis is going to attack our healthcare system, it also, I think, lessens the risk of like some kind of like massive martial law response, right? Because
Yeah,
if there is less of a crisis, there will be less need for like, you know, soldiers with boots on the ground type scenario, less justification for it. But you know, something I kind of like I mentioned briefly earlier, like just in terms of the martial law thing, because I kind of want to jump back to that, is the Stanford Prison Experiment, right? Because I think this is something that's very important to understand, because it's very easy to sort of trust police that where there's a regulatory framework, I think we're all like nervous about any interaction with the police because of what they can do as things stand, you know. But if you create a situation um, where someone is given supreme authority and other people are given no authority, no self-autonomy even, right? There is a very serious thing that occurs. And I think like for people who don't know what the Stanford Prison Experiment was,
Or didn't work in group homes.
yeah, that too. In Berkeley, California, um, there was an experiment in the 70s, right? I believe. Um,
I think so. It's like
and
folklore now.
yeah, it was a bunch of like psychology students that over the summer, um, they decided to set up this basically what would now I think be considered like a highly unethical experiment. But they took like basically two control groups of somewhere in the realm of I think 12 people each, and half of them they made um, play the roles of prisoners, and they set up sort of an area with locked doors and things as like a prison, and the other half they gave the role as guards, and they monitored them to see what the results would be over time. And when these guards had this authority over people, they naturally started to abuse them, and they were physically abusive. They tortured them. They isolated them. They deprived them of food and water. They did a lot of unconscionable things, right? And this is something that happens when you shift power balances drastically.
And the reverse is also true, right? Like
Yeah,
the inmates started to internalize their victimhood and started behaving like inmates and started subjecting or submitting to the will of this arbitrary authority.
that's right. And I think that that is in major danger, because like if you look at say, if we assume that martial law will be this sort of temporary thing while there's a crisis going on, that has a major effect on the psychology of human beings during that crisis, how people will be treated. Like, will doors be kicked down where they don't need to, right? Will people be arrested, detained, interned, abused in ways that are completely unnecessary? I mean, I think all of that is unnecessary because let's be honest, the only thing that's really necessary as a response to this thing is for people to stay home and for people to receive medical treatment when they need it, you know? Like there's no other, like there's no need for people to not be allowed to talk to one another. There's no need for there to be um, you know no right to a fair trial. Like none of that has any effect in helping to quell, you know what I mean? Like I suppose you could make the argument if there was some sort of crazy social disturbance where people were running around like, I don't know, knocking over mailboxes and smashing in people's windows looking for food, that you might need a security presence on the ground. But like, I don't think we have to get there, you know? Um,
And it's not a foregone conclusion that we will, but
no,
it's something something people should prepare themselves for. There's like always like a normalcy bias built into life that's like, thing hasn't happened yet, so it's not going to happen. And
yeah,
those statements are usually true right up until the moment they're not. And, you know, it's it's hard to tell. Like it's hard to tell where this thing is going because like as of now, it's been so fucking predictable in
yeah,
that for the last 2 months, it's just been a slow motion train wreck of it playing out exactly the way people projected that it would. And, you know, we had like a tremendous head start,
yeah,
to this. And a lot of people I'm interfacing with are still at this weird sort of like hope for the best, kind of like, you
yeah,
know, we'll do this for a couple of weeks or, things will go back to normal soon. Like, let's flatten the curve. Like, it's not that I'm pessimistic. It's just, I think like this is, we're at, like, I remember a couple of days ago, we were at 4,000 cases. Okay.
yeah,
A couple of days later, we're now closing in on 8,000 cases. Like, that seems manageable, but that's what doubling looks like when it's small, 4 to 8, we
yeah,
doubled. The next time we double in a couple of days, it's going to be 16,000. and then 32. And, you know, it has the potential to spiral out of control very fucking quickly, you know?
Yeah.
And I encourage people to look at these videos that people in Italy filmed talking to their former selves from 10 days ago, just begging, like, what would you say to yourself 10 days ago? And just begging themselves to take this more seriously, and that they had no idea. And, you know, like, I think we're at a place where people are starting to take it seriously, finally. But, you know,
Yeah.
like when you look at like some of the reactions on social media and all like the snickering and kind of like the weird tone of that was taken in regards to people panic buying toilet paper, like how that just became such a giant meme, such like a giant joke, where like, you know, the utility of buying hygiene supplies and food should have been like immediately obvious to everyone. And, you know, if you don't have a supply of toilet paper, you're an asshole, because you know, you had a lot of time to fucking get one. And
Well,
and it also goes into another thing, and just because like I know most people don't approach this from like any sort of free market perspective, but like, can we talk about price gouging for a second and the actual social utility that it serves? You know, like people are all horrified that they go and like hand sanitizer is $13 a bottle or whatever. But at the same time, people are all ridiculously upset that all the hand sanitizer are sold at. So like when the supply and demand curves get out of whack, raising the price of a product like that arbitrarily high is what prevents panic buying, and what it's the thing that prevents empty shelves. It's the thing that makes sure the first person who walks in the store doesn't buy everything, right? Because they see it's marked up to a huge price. They're just going to buy the minimal amount that they need to get through this thing. And it's a way of rationing scarce resources, but it's a market function that has economic utility. And contrary to what people believe, it's not just a function of like greedy capitalists trying to take advantage in a crisis. They are trying to keep the products on the shelves that you want. And if they didn't price gouge, there wouldn't be any products on the shelves. And this also goes to another thing, like with Doug Ford's press conference, talking about, oh, you know, talking tough, we're going to go after these companies. Like, this is another example of like incremental government tyranny. Like, do you want the provincial government setting prices?
Like, you know what? That's actually like you raised something really important there, is that tyranny often comes in defense of the people, right? Like it's sort of a misguided defense, you know. It's like the people are starving, we need strong action now, or you know, people are not getting access to supplies. We need to force people to provide them with, you know what I mean? And like I think there's yeah, it's very easy for someone to gain broad powers to control and manipulate people's lives in a way that people feel like they are being defended, you know. And I think that's a very dangerous thing in a time of fear, because like, you know, if this say, I mean, like you can have a similar discussion around something that I think, you know, is more common, like the universal healthcare thing, or you know, things along those lines, in a time when there's no crisis. And you will kind of have a debate, right? Like someone will say like, you know, education should be free or something, you know, and then there can be a conversation about whether or not it should be free. There will be back and forth. But, you know, when it's something like, you know, hand sanitizer is too expensive, like we're being price gouged, and everybody's scared and worried they're not going to have anything, and somebody comes along and says, I'm not going to let these companies gouge people. And
he got a lot of praise from it too, from the same liberals who hate his fucking guts, you know?
Yeah, you know, but it's very easy. Again, you've got this like drowning man grabbing a rope, not knowing there's a hook in it, right?
Yeah.
I think, and yeah, it's a lot easier to push it like that through when you feel like survival is on the line, but he's actually destroying the very mechanism that's keeping them supplied. Because, you know, it's a scary thing. Now, I do want to say though that I think that a shitty thing that probably happened was you know, some dirty rent-seeking behavior where, say, people bought massive amounts of toilet paper and hand sanitizer, seeing this coming, and then jacked up the prices because they knew they could make a profit off of it, right? And
Dirty what behavior?
I don't even remember what I said. Um, let's say dirty Sanchez behavior, um, like rent-seeking, I would say, or like, well, I mean, I guess
Trying to
like,
get
you
me in
know,
trouble, Peter.
hoarding and selling.
Jesus Christ.
I'll show you my gun rack later, but like,
Yeah,
yeah,
people
no,
are
I
going to
think,
hoard and sell for sure, you
yeah.
know, and
But and I also think, okay, there's something else important here, right? Because you and I kind of had like a little bit more of an inkling than most people that this was sort of coming down the pipe, and I did stock up about, you know, I stocked up some supplies ahead of time, and I didn't panic buy. Like I didn't
yeah,
hoard. I didn't actually buy any extra toilet paper because you can't eat it. You know, if I run out of toilet paper, I can get by. And this is an insurance policy. It's not like, you know, I'm hoping that like I'm gonna be eating canned food for like 2 weeks or a month, right? Like it's an insurance policy against like a supply chain shutdown or me having to stay home and not being able to leave the house
yeah,
at all, you know. And so yeah, like I
yeah.
stocked
And
up with the
we did the
appropriate.
opposite of panic. We
Yeah, I was able
prepared
to do it by
in a
buying a few
rational,
cans at a time over a period of time that didn't
yeah,
tax the system in the way that things are happening now. And when it was panic buying time, like when things started to disappear off the shelves, I was able to get like a couple of bags of rice just to round things out, you know, and just make sure as things going. So you know, I feel like I handled that pretty well. Although I will say that I think that I hope that after this is all over, we all take the lesson that we should have like maybe
yeah,
even a couple of months worth of supplies for an emergency that we keep stocked
a
and
real
checked.
first aid kit, canned
Yeah, you know,
food. Yeah,
like it's sad that we needed a crisis to sort of see the relevance of doing something like that. But I do think it protects even like this sort of economics of it, right? Like this idea of an economic downturn. It's like the economy can handle like a shutdown a lot better if people have like, you know, if there's a little energy in the battery, let's say, you know, like I think that yeah, I think a lot
yeah.
of things like that.
I don't know, man. I I find it hard. My own bias is I find it very hard to imagine a situation in which um, something like martial law is actually implemented. But
Like you feel like it's not going to happen.
well, you know what I feel ain't sort of the issue. You certain like my intuition is sort of like it won't get there. But it's like I have that same bias that everyone else does. That I believe it hasn't happened before. I don't have a reference point for it. Um, but if you were to sort of envision hypothetically the circumstances that might lead to a government implementing martial law, it's something like this. I mean, the restrictive measures they've already taken are
Yeah.
pretty insane. And that's worth noting, like whatever your position is on like the border issue, like if people are in favor of more or less immigration or closing or not closing borders, it's interesting to note that for the past like as long as people have been debating this stuff, decades, the thing they always told you is you can't close borders. It's like it's sort of like sweeping leaves on a windy day. That it's just like an impossibility, and that's why it shouldn't even be discussed. But it's interesting to see when government wants to actually fucking do something, how fucking quick they are at doing it.
Yeah.
Because like wow, like just like that, now all the borders are closed.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting to note that the same people who told you that that wasn't possible are now the same people telling you that they have to do it. And that's what I mean, where it's like, where's your level of trust in government? It's like these people lie for a living. And if they're going to be the only voices you're allowed to hear, like how much faith do you have in that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is, I mean, precisely it, right? Like, you know, I mean, look at the sort of extra leeway that's already being given to politicians. Like, people are still, say, critical of like Donald Trump as ever, but I think that he even is getting a little bit more leeway in terms of like, you know, what sweeping initiatives are you going to make? And it's like, remember that these people are the same people that have put us in a war with Afghanistan for like 20 years, that like, you know, bombed Iraq, that like were launching drone strikes that killed like 80% civilians.
Hmm.
You know, they make decisions like this, you know, arguably who um, were, you know, responsible for the murder of Jeffrey Epstein, and, you know, were involved in some very shady business with child prostitution. Like, I mean, you know, we'll never know the answers to those
Or
things, I think.
just to bring it
But
closer to home, like
I do
with
believe that.
Canada, like
Yeah,
we have a political class that has like who is more comfortable criticizing the orange man than the CCP, right? You know,
yeah,
and like, you know, that's disturbing in and of itself. And this is, once again, regardless of whatever people think about fucking orange man bad, or, you know, you like the guy or you hate him or whatever, like the fact that our leaders don't have the political stomach or backbone to denounce the actions of the CCP. And, you know, I'm using my words here carefully. I'm saying the regime, the Communist Party of China, the regime, the totalitarian, despotic regime that runs that fucking country, not the people, you
yeah,
know, but like their actions in this have been just, you know, completely tyrannical, you know, and
yeah.
it would
Well,
be,
they come from a place of tyranny, right? So you're seeing how a tyrannical society deals with a crisis. And it's not the first time. Like, so, you know, like Chernobyl, you know, again, something that very arguably was caused by totalitarianism, because people were afraid to report things. People were afraid to discuss
no one was
things.
incentivized to give the higher ups bad news, right?
Everything's covered up, right?
Yeah.
Like, and it's the same sort of, yeah, the same principle is at play here. And yeah, so like aside from like I don't want soldiers in the streets telling me what I can and can't do, taking me in the middle of the night, I think that is a very important thing, is that like, you know, totalitarianism and tyranny were the cause, not the cure for this thing. And that if we're going to beat it, we're going to
Yeah.
need innovation, we're going to need intercommunication, we're going to need the freedom that allows us to generate solutions and like network, you
Yeah.
know, and that's I think like everything positive that I've seen coming out of this is stuff like that. Like the smartest people in the room, um, the most compassionate people in the room, the most courageous people in the room, like putting their lives on the line, like putting their heads together, sharing ideas and information, you know, and that's, yeah, that's where I see the solution coming out of this. And yeah, any kind of tyrannical response takes all of those weapons away from us in this fight. You know, I do think that we may need some, you know, there, like, I don't know, like, I can't imagine that if things get chaotic on the street or something, that you're not going to need some kind of like, you know, heavier police presence or what have you. Like, you know, being real in this situation, I would love it if we had already solved those problems in advance and we had like voluntary and free solutions to solve those problems, but we don't yet. Um, but yeah, like freedom is going to help us solve this problem,
Yeah.
and robbing us of that will take that away, you know?
And yeah, no, I agree with that completely. And, you know, we should probably cut it off now. I think we've been going for, I don't know, like a check, but why don't we cut it off now and shit, man, we'll pick it up another time. But
Yeah.
good talking, good seeing you, Peter.
Yeah, always a pleasure. And I would like to say to anyone who ends up listening to this that this is our very first attempt at this. So be gentle.
Yeah, be gentle.
Yeah. And you know what though, before we go, I do want to say one thing. Like my purposes here where like I wanted to go before like anything gets implemented, I wanted to go on record as saying that yeah, I don't like the idea that I'm not willing to just let my freedom be taken from me lately. And I want to go on record on that, like while it's still possible to do so. And also, like I want people to be talking about this while it's still possible to do so. And I
Yeah.
hope that what we did here, like, has contributed to that in some way.
Amen, brother.
All right, man.
All
Take it
right,
easy. Have
take
a good one.
care. Stay safe.
Ciao. You too.